All right, it looks like we've reached our starting time, and I think we're ready to get rolling. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here this afternoon for our grain stocks breakout session. My name is Lance Honig. I'm Chief of the Crops Branch here at NASS. I'm going to serve as the moderator for this session. I'm also joined by Jeff Bailey. He's Chief of the Summary, Estimation, and Disclosure Branch here at NASS. And then also I've got Chris Hawthorne, who is the head of our field crop section within the crops branch here at NASS, and they're going to be sharing some information with you here this afternoon as well. Before we get to them though, we've got just a few items I want to share, some housekeeping items. First off, you heard this if you were part of the general session earlier, but we are recording this session, so it will be available actually by tomorrow morning for folks who want to go back and view any of this again. As well as eventually we'll get the Q&A transcripts out there as well on the website. In addition to that, if you need the closed captioning feature, you can certainly do that by utilizing the closed caption button on the Zoom ribbon. And then last but not least, for the Q&A portion of this session, make sure you enter your questions using the Q&A button on the Zoom ribbon. And then when we get to the end of this session, we'll be working through those as quickly as we can. As far as the session here this afternoon, I wanted to start out and just make a few comments relative specifically to grain stocks. First off, you can see our mission statement here at NASS is to provide timely, accurate, and useful statistics in service to U.S. agriculture. And certainly there's a lot of things we do to make sure we meet that mission, but two areas I wanted to kind of focus on today, which kind of shapes our presentation for you here today, is two topics. One is continual improvement. We believe very strongly in always trying to improve everything we do here at NASS. And we think that speaks directly to our mission statement, especially when it relates to timely, accurate, and useful. If we want to continue to maintain those features of our mission, we need to continually improve. And then the second is transparent. And specifically, if you look in the mission statement, useful and in service to U.S. agriculture, we feel like if we really want to meet that part of our objective, then we've got to be transparent in the things that we do here at NASS. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on in this session today, specifically for grain stocks. And so in the area of continual improvement, one item that I wanted to point out is a grain stocks program review that's currently underway at NASS. Just to give you some idea of how important we feel about this, we have a number of what we call top 10 priorities here at NASS. You know, everything's important, and if you make everything a number one priority, you know what that means. And so we've identified some top 10 items that we want to focus on at NASS, and one of those is specifically improving programs that we do here at NASS. And for this year, that top 10 item is grain stocks. And so we've launched a fairly extensive review of the grain stocks program within NASS. It's going to hit all aspects of the program, both on-farm and off-farm. And to give you an idea what everything means, it starts with sampling, works through the questionnaires that we use to collect the data, the editing process, the summarization process that we do with the information that we collect, and it will also include the estimation procedures that we use for everything that we do here at NASS. And so we feel like that again, really touches on that continual improvement. We certainly look at these programs each and every year, but this is a deeper dive that we'll be doing this year. When it comes to transparent, there's a couple of items I want to point out. The first was mentioned in the opening session today, so if you were here then, you heard mention of the Methodology and Quality Measures Report for grain stocks. We just issued it last week, so on April 8th. That afternoon, we put the first edition of that report out. It will come out each and every year following the January grain stocks report. And what you can find in there is detailed methodology information. There's a fairly lengthy write-up of the procedures that we use, but also it includes a lot of quality metrics as well. Things like sample size, response rates, CVs for the various surveys that we do for the grain stocks estimates. You can see a link listed here in this presentation as well. We'll drop a copy of the link to that report in the chat window as well, so that you can click on that and access it. And you're going to get a lot of details about that report, I think, as we work through the presentation here today. And then the second item that I want to mention relative to transparency is really this session. This is an opportunity for us to walk through the survey methodology that we use, data editing and review procedures, how we handle non-response. Not everyone that completes the forms that we send out. So how do we deal with that? And then last but not least, we'll also touch on the estimating procedures that we use here at NASS when setting grain stocks estimates. So that's what this session is going to be about. That's how we're going to walk through it. We're going to start things off by talking about the survey methodology side of things, and that's where I'm going to turn things over to Jeff Bailey. As I mentioned at the beginning, he's going to be presenting some of this information for us. So Jeff, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right, thank you, Lance. Good afternoon, everyone. And as we talk about this, we're going to talk about two different surveys that the grain stocks data come from. That's the portion that comes from the on-farm and the portion that comes from the off-farm. So first we have the portion that comes from the on-farm. I'll be referring to that as the agricultural survey. And so that survey collects the capacity and grain stocks, but also collects the acreage and production throughout the year from the farmers. So we use one survey to do both of those. Then the off-farm grain stocks portion collects the capacity and grain stocks for those stored off the farm. Both of these surveys have a reference date of the first of the month, September 1, December 1, January 1, March 1, June 1. We can start data collection 2 days prior to the reference date, and then we collect data for about 15 days. And then the data is released at the end of the month, except in December, one stocks are released in early January. So as we go through these slides, I'm going to be talking about both of these surveys. And as you can see on this next slide, I've got two columns here. And so it'll show you the sampling for both of these surveys. And then sometimes it's just one slide because everything's done the same for both of the surveys. So hopefully you can not get confused which survey that I'm talking about. So the reason we might have two different surveys is because we're sampling from two different target populations. That's the farmers and then the elevators and terminals. And so for the farmer survey, the agriculture survey, that target population is all the farms that have cropland and capacity. And so for this survey, we use a dual frame approach or multiple frame approach. And that's our list frame and area frame. And we use this because we know that our list frame is missing some farms. Farms go in and out of business every day. It's impossible to have a perfect list frame. So we use our area frame to help us measure the incompleteness of our list. Then for the off-farm grain stocks, the target population for that, of course, is all the known entities that store grain. That's 1,000 bushels or more. That's our elevators and terminal operations and those things. So in both of these at the sampling stage, we group these into strata or similar groups, and that's used for the non-response adjustment. The agricultural survey is grouped based on cropland and capacity, and then the off-farm grain stocks is grouped into strata by the size and any specialty commodities that they store. Okay, next slide, please, Lance. Okay, so this is about the agriculture survey, a little bit more about the sampling. So the list sample portion of that is selected using the multivariate probability proportion to size. And I'm just a mouthful. So we can get target multiple commodities. Obviously, different crops are important in different states. And so we can target the crops that are specific to each individual state. Within this sample, we do use replicates or groups of records that are purposely used in consecutive quarters so we can get a better measure of change from quarter to quarter. So that's the list portion. And then we have the area portion, and this is used to measure the undercoverage of our list. You may have heard of the June area survey, which we conduct every year in June. It's a survey of segments of land, not of operations. And when we go out to these, the enumerators identify all the agricultural operations in each of these sampled areas of land. And then we can compare this list that we gather from these sampled segments to the list frame. And any operation that's not found on our list, We refer to that as NOL records. Then we can sample those in a follow-on survey. All those records are used in June when we initially collect the data, and then a subsample is drawn for the following quarters. Okay, next slide. So we talk about edit analysis. This is pretty well similar for both surveys. They both use multiple modes of data collection. Mail and web are the most cost efficient, but due to the short time period of data collection, most of the data is collected via CADI, that is computer assisted telephone interview. The data are edited or cleaned once it's received at the office. We make sure the data is reasonable and it is consistent with previous reports. Then we move into analysis, and the data here is compared to other similar reports using an interactive analysis tools so we can visualize the trends in the data and quickly identify any outliers. If data seem unusual or incorrect, we verify that it's been recorded correctly, and sometimes we'll even recontact the respondent. Next slide. So a little bit about non-response adjustment. As Lance mentioned, not everyone responds to our surveys, but we still must account for these non-respondents in our estimates. And for both of these surveys, the largest and most unique operations are manually estimated by analysts in our regional field offices. For the remaining operations, in the agriculture survey, for the farmer survey, we use machine imputation for the farms that do not respond. And I'll have more details on how we do that in the next slide. Then for the off-farm grain stocks, we adjust the weights of the respondents to account for the non-respondents. Both of these non-respondents adjustments are assuming the same thing. And we're assuming that the non-respondents in a group of operations that are similar, that their respondents are, the non-respondents are similar to the respondents in those. Next slide. So this is the non-response adjustment for the agriculture survey, the farmer portion of the survey. So I want to go into more detail about that. So whether the respondent refused to one question in the grain stock section or the whole survey, all the missing items will be imputed. So as mentioned previously, records are grouped with other records that are similar, and that is by location and by the strata that was assigned at the sampling stage. Location, we used agricultural statistics district. So the first step of imputation is to impute the capacity. So capacity is we'll first be using what was reported last in a previous quarter, if they reported that. If that's not available, then we'll calculate the ratio of the current reported capacity to the list frame capacity from complete reports in that imputation group. The ratio is then applied to the list frame capacity of the non-respondents. So that imputes capacity. Then we move on to compute for individual stock items. And they'll be imputed in a similar fashion, but this time it's the ratio of current reported stocks to current capacity of the complete reports in that imputation group. And then that ratio is applied to the record needed imputed. So just to give you a little example here. If we have a group of records and let's say there's these similar records, 25% of their capacity has corn storage. Then for the non-respondent, we'll impute 25% of his capacity with corn. Each imputation group must have at least 5 reports for the calculated ratios to be used. If we don't have 5 complete reports in a group, then we will collapse groups until we do have at least 5. Next slide, please. All right. Whenever we conduct a survey, there will always be some level of uncertainty in the estimates that produced, and we typically categorize these errors into 2 types: sampling errors and non-sampling errors. And sampling errors occur whenever you take a sample instead of a census. So we purposely are taking a sample from the agriculture survey because the population is so large. And we typically measure the sampling error with the coefficient of variation, or CV for short. And CV is also what we use to target. We set target CVs. so that we can evaluate how well our survey performed and adjust the sample procedures for the next cycle accordingly. So as we have larger samples, we get lower CVs. So we can control our sample size based on the target CV that we're shooting for. And then since off-farm grain stocks is a census, and there is actually technically no sampling error in the off-farm grain stocks. But both surveys do have non-sampling errors. Non-sampling errors is just essentially everything else, but they're difficult to measure because there's a lot of different sources of those. Those could be such things as reporting errors, recording errors, editing errors, non-response errors, etc. Many different things. Now, to minimize non-sampling errors, we conduct different things, conduct tests on our tools prior to the survey. For testing, we analyze and validate the survey data and various other ways to do analysis to help us control for non-sampling errors. Okay. Finally, we have data. Now that we have all the data collected, we have all the data analyzed, we're ready to calculate the estimates. Well, we have two main types of estimators. That's direct expansion estimators and ratio estimators. Direct expansions are used to calculate the total capacity or the total stocks. So now for the agriculture survey, we create weighted sum using the reported, imputed, and estimated data and the original sampling weights. And then for the off-farm grain stocks, the weighted sum is calculated using reported and estimated data along with non-response adjusted weights. So we're going to calculate total capacity and total stocks for each of the stocks for each item. So that's a direct expansion ratio. Now for the direct expansion. Now for the ratio estimate, it's simply the ratio of two direct expansions. The key is that the records must have a complete data for both the numerator and the denominator. That would be like for the current quarter and the previous quarter to be included in the ratio. For the non-agriculture survey, no imputed data is used for the ratio estimates, and non-response is adjusted via reweighting. Some examples of ratios that we calculate are the ratio of stocks to capacity or the ratio of current stocks to previous stocks. Next slide, please. As Lance mentioned, we recently published the grain stocks and quality measures report last week. And a lot of the things that I've just gone over are in that report to explain all the methodology. There's also tables of data. And so these are some of the items that you will find in that quality measures document. First, you'll find the sample size. The sample size listed there does exclude out of business operations and operations with no items of interest. It also has a survey response rate. And one thing to note about what we're publishing in these reports is that they do follow the Office of Management budget guidelines on how we are to report these. And these do not include those out of business reports and reports that have no item of interest. So we also have the weighted item response rate. This is the response rate calculated at the item level. For example, like corn stalks. What's the non-response for corn stalks? To show how much of the survey estimate came from reported data that was expanded by the sampling weights. And for off-grain stocks, that's the sampling weights are all 1. So this is proportional to the survey estimate to the actual reported data. The final thing in that report will be the CVs. And that's to measure the sampling error and the non-sampling error due to unit non-response. The CV is calculated by taking the ratio of the standard error to the survey estimate and expressing that as a percentage. Okay, this is a couple, 3 charts here. I've got one for each of the crops. This is for corn stalks. So this graph shows the CVs for the farm portion of the corn stalks over the last 10 years. And this shows it in relation to the target CV. So the red bar across that graph is the target CV. That's the CV we wanted to achieve. We've tried to design our surveys to reach that target, to be under that target. The CVs are expressed as a percentage so that the unit of the y-axis is the CV percent. That first red bar is at 2%. And the CVs are grouped on the x-axis by the quarter And that's because CVs shift as the marketing year progresses. At the beginning of the marketing year, which is December here for corn stalks, on-farm grain stocks are at their highest levels and CVs are the lowest. But as the on-farm stocks decrease over time and they become more scarce, we see more variability in our estimates as measured by the CV. However, it is important to remember that the standard error will also be decreasing over the marketing year. Lance will have some additional discussion on this topic later in the presentation. The takeaway message from this chart is that the Agricultural Survey has been performing well over the last 10 years based on the target CVs for corn stalks. There's only like 1 quarter in June and 2 quarters in September where we are above our target when you look at that chart. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This is for soybeans. So we have a similar chart for on-farm soybean stocks. As you can see here, September shows even more variability, being the last quarter of the marketing year. But in most recent years, the CV has been within the target CV. September 2014, which is the highest CV in my charts, was a very unique quarter for soybean stocks. And then the last one here is for wheat, for all wheat stocks. The quarters are different for the marketing year, but the pattern is the same. Here, see, we start with September, and then the last quarter is June. And again, the survey has been performing well with respect to all the wheat stocks target CVs. So this brings me to the end of my slides, and now I'll turn it over to Chris Hawthorne from here. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about our grain stocks estimation program, kind of add a little bit more to what Jeff and Lance has said. And so all of our estimates are included, all of our grain stocks estimates are included in our grain stocks report. That is a quarterly report that covers December 1, March 1, June 1, and September 1. One thing to keep in mind that it does not include a forecast of ending stocks. All right, next slide. So just to kind of give you a breakdown of on-farm versus off-farm, Jeff explained a little bit about the surveys that go into those. I'm just going to touch on what those are. So on-farm are all whole grains or oil seeds stored on the farm, regardless of ownership or intended use on the survey reference date. The regardless of ownership is important to consider here because if it's for example, if it's a neighbor's farm, a neighbor's grain that's stored on another, on your operation, you would report that grain to us on because that is actually on your operation. So we also want to say that it includes grain in permanent and temporary storage. Not as important on the on-farm side, but that's definitely very important once we get into the off-farm, especially around harvest time. There's a lot of temporary storage in parking lots and things like that, and that'll be included on, and I'll explain that on the off-farm side. We do exclude grain in transit for both on-farm and off-farm. So next slide. So off-farm, we're going to be talking about the same definition, all whole grains, oil seeds on hand, but we're talking about stored in a commercial facility off the farm, including processing plants, terminals, and commercial elevators. Again, this is regardless of ownership, so if it's at that facility, even if it's owned by a farmer that is reporting his, has his own stocks to report on farm, if it is on the premises of one of these commercial facilities, the commercial facility will report it under their off-farm stocks. Again, we include any grain in permanent and temporary storage, like I said, and also excludes any grain in transit. Next slide. So how does the data get from either the farmer data collection or the the facility, the elevator data collection. So the data collection starts at the regional field offices. They're the ones that are responsible for managing the data collection process. They're going to be looking at the data analysis, looking for outliers, looking at any misreported information. Like Jeff said, we possibly follow up with those operations or elevators to get the right data. Once all that has been summarized at the state level, our regional field offices submit state recommendations. They make estimates for their states and their region, and they send those recommendations to headquarters. At the headquarters level, we're looking at, we really are focusing on the U.S. level. So we summarize all of those state recommendations, and we get to see our total U.S. picture. And then that's when we get into the board discussion. We have our national board, and then once we get done with that national board and have a national board target, then we'll go back and reconcile the state recommendations to make sure that they add up to that national target. Next slide. So with the on-farm board estimation, these are some of the tools that we have at our disposal. Like Jeff said, we get that data from our agricultural survey by talking to farmers. Some of the indications we look at are the historic published board to survey indication ratios. This is just how those survey indications perform historically against our final board numbers for those quarters. We also look at stocks as a percentage of board production, which is very important as we go through quarter to quarter to see how that is being used. And then we also look at the survey indicated farm disappearance. This is really at the percentage level and at the actual quantity level. So it's important to look at it from both perspectives. As I said earlier, we do have our NASS regional field office recommendations we'll be taking a look at. And then we also have some check data like the FSA loan data that we will look at. We want to make sure we at least cover what's there by state and at the U.S. level on the FSA loan data. All right, next slide. So off-farm estimation, of course, it is a census of all known facilities. So we're going to be looking at all the summarized data indications from that off-farm grain stock survey. We do like to look and see the percentage of data from imputed records, just to see how much data came from those non-responses. Just to make sure we're in the ballpark with what we've seen in historically, and make sure that if we did estimate for a large facility or a larger facility that has a large impact at the U.S. level, we'll take another closer look at that. Make sure before it goes out that has been correctly estimated. We also have state license data. So that's not on every state, but some states do have state license data that we can take a look at. We want to make sure that if we have that data available, that we look at it and make sure that it is consistent with that data that's already been published. And then after we look at the indications, we also want to take a look at the balance sheet. That's very important that we make sure that all of our indications are in line with what we're seeing in the other data that's available out there. And so the balance sheet approach is the way we kind of pull all that data together. We want to look at it, at the U.S. level, not on the on-farm or off-farm side in particular, but just a total look at the total stocks that we have. So next slide. I'll get into each one of these components now. So obviously we start off with beginning supply. NASS provides the previous season ending stocks. We also provide the current season production, and then we add that to the Commerce Department's forecasted imports. So that gives us a starting point for the year. And then from quarter to quarter, we have the known disappearance. So we have exports that also comes from the Commerce Department. Food, feed, and industrial kind of comes from a variety of sources. One of those sources is our NASS care reports that we can see things like grain crushings and ethanol production and things like that. One thing to keep in mind that this does not include feed use. That is a part of our residual, and it's kind of part of that unknown at the end that we have to kind of account for and balance out. All right, next. All right. Another component that we like to look at is the grain consuming animal units. This comes from USDA's ERS in their feed grains outlook. Just gives us an indication of the livestock that are out there on feed. And then we can see whether our residual level is in line with those livestock numbers. And then finally, our residual. That's kind of our catch-all. It's really the total supply minus the usage minus the stocks. We do review this on a quarterly and annual basis, but the main thing that we want to look at is really forecasting out on the annual basis. Are we going down a trend that might not make sense in line with the remaining components of the balance sheet? So next slide. This is just kind of a snapshot of how we would look at the balance sheet, what it would look like, and how we look at that when we have our board discussions. Next slide. So here we get to our board discussion. This is where we take our estimation kind of to the next level. We want to make sure that what our indications are showing fit with what we're seeing on all those balance sheet information, on all those balance sheet components. We want to make sure that, you know, if we look at the accumulated residual at the end of the year, or kind of where we're looking at going, we want to make sure that, you know, for certain crops that there's not a negative accumulated residual. We want to make sure that the residual is in line with historic trends, and that you know, any residual, like I said earlier, with the grain consuming animal units, and keeping in mind all of our livestock inventory reports, that it's in line with those inventories. And Lance will go into a little bit more about some of the board discussion and some of the balance sheet information here in a little bit. Next slide, please. And then we often get questions, and the last few years we've gotten a few more questions about our revisions process. So I just kind of wanted to take you through, you know, our revisions process, when that happens and how that happens. Revisions can happen on a previous quarter. We also look at making revisions, you know, annually, and then after our 5-year census revisions. From a quarter perspective, we may get late data or updated data from elevators. That's something that we often get. So we want to make sure that if we did estimate or impute for those elevators, and we did receive some late data after the publication of the last quarter, we want to make sure that we get that corrected data, the actual data from them, in if we do receive that. You know, and occasionally we do have re-interview data, like happened in 2019. So we want to make sure, since that estimated unharvested production is technically stocks, we want to make sure that once we harvest that, then we adjust those unharvested acres, which would ultimately adjust the stocks values for those states and those crops. And then, of course, we look at the board balance sheet as we get further into the marketing year. If we notice that something is kind of going into a different direction than what we expect or we should be seeing, then that's another discussion we might have at the board level. Annual revisions, again, really have to do with late data that can come in. Usually on the quarterly basis, we only look at the previous quarter. On the annual basis, we have an opportunity to open up all the previous quarters going back for a year. And so if we have any other late data coming in or new data coming in from elevators, we can update that there. And then we also have a more thorough discussion at the end of the year of what the balance sheet looks like. And then, of course, after the 5-year census revisions, we make some updates there. So, all right, I'm going to turn it over to Lance. He's got the next few slides.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. I've just got a few comments I want to make, kind of just building on what Chris was just talking about, largely about the balance sheet and kind of how we utilize that, and a little bit about the revision process in particular. This slide that I have really just highlighting the fact that, you know, when you look at a balance sheet, a lot of these components that we talk about, whether it's imports, exports, seed use, which is relatively small, or that food and industrial use, which of course is going to be different for each commodity. When we look at these, it's something that on a quarterly basis, there is a forecast piece involved there. In other words, these data are typically incomplete on a quarterly basis. So for example, when we just set the March stocks from a import, export, and use standpoint, we were talking about a December to February period. And as Chris mentioned, imports and exports, that's all tracked by the Commerce Department. But when you're in that March timeframe, you've really only got 2 of the 3 months complete tracking from Commerce Department. So at that point, you're already forecasting out what that 3rd month might look like. From a use standpoint, it's kind of the same situation, although it comes from different sources. That 3rd month is not complete. And in some cases on all these items, there can even be some adjustments that happen in the earlier months. And so as we look at these components and we talk about having opportunities to make revisions in the following quarter, part of the reason is because portions of the balance sheet were incomplete when we set that stocks estimate 3 months earlier. And so again, looking at what a balance sheet looks like, this just kind of builds out on the graphic that Chris showed you, shows you all those quarters that follow. We track this all throughout the season. And as we move ahead to a following quarter, we have more information, not only about the previous quarters because of the reasons I just mentioned, but also knowing what that next quarter looks like can sometimes give you a little bit of additional insight about how things look the previous quarter. And so as a reminder, we do open up the previous quarter to revision all year long. That's always been our revision practice. In recent months and quarters, we've seen a little bit larger revisions happening there, and I think that raised some questions among folks as to why we were doing that. But the fact of the matter is the previous quarter was always open to revision. And as Chris mentioned, in January, we actually open up all quarters in the previous market year as well. But it's not just stocks that are subject to revision, production is as well. And so when we look at a balance sheet, obviously stocks and production both have an impact on what that balance sheet looks like. And so when we look at crops like corn and soybeans, we actually open up the previous year's production to revision in September, the same time frame when we get to the end of the marketing season, so that we're able to make those decisions simultaneously as to whether the revision, if needed, needs to happen with production or if it needs to happen with stocks or both. So we work that all in the same time frame. I know we've had some questions in the past as to why do we wait all the way until September to make production revisions if we're not actually getting new production information. And the answer there is that, again, if it's going to happen and if it's going to be based on decisions revolving around a balance sheet, we really need to have complete information from that entire marketing year before we can determine whether or not adjustments might need to be made to production for that marketing season. So that's why we've tried to synchronize that up with the end of the marketing season. Just a couple of additional slides I'll share. Again, this is really based largely on some information from that methodology and quality measures report that I referred to. A couple of graphics on the screen just to kind of, again, tie back kind of how the relationship works between the balance sheet and the estimates that we set. What you see on the left here, I've actually taken the CV for corn, on-farm corn stocks from the report that I just referenced, and I've applied that to our published on-farm corn stocks estimates. We don't publish our indications, those indications that come from the agricultural survey. So what I've done is I've just applied those CVs to the published estimates to calculate a standard error. So again, kind of getting away from that percentage and putting it in terms of bushels. And so for corn, graphically, this just gives you a visual look at exactly what, for example, ±2 standard errors would look like based on the measure of uncertainty that we have from the indications that we receive. And so you can kind of see how that relates. You kind of see the scale on there, kind of ±200 million bushels. Sounds like a big number, but when you think about a roughly 15 billion bushel crop, you're actually talking about fairly small range within those numbers that we have. And then on the right, just kind of a visual of how one might track a residual over time and how on a quarterly basis, you might see some variation, but what we really worry about the most is how that's accumulating throughout the year. And so even if that residual or unaccounted for or unmeasured usage is, maybe varying a little bit quarter by quarter, what we really worry the most about when we look at these trends is how are we tracking on an accumulated basis? And the further we get into the season, that becomes more and more relevant. Just wanted to share again those same pieces of information for soybeans and all wheat. Again, these are calculations that you could make directly from the information that we've published in that methodology and quality measures report as well. And then really the last piece of information I wanted to share, again, this is more information from that report. Here you can see the response rates for both the agricultural surveys up in the upper left corner, which of course feed into the on-farm stocks estimates. On the lower right, you can see what those response rates look like for off-farm grain stocks surveys that we conduct. And a couple of points I want to make here. First of all, Jeff kind of touched on this a little bit, that these response rates, as well as the sample sizes that you see in that report, are based on the OMB guidelines that were given for reporting. And what that means is it does exclude some items like out of business operations and those who do not have the items of interest. And so if you do any comparison between the numbers you see in that report with what we have historically shared in our briefing packages, you'll see slight differences there. And again, that's because based on the OMB guidelines, what we report there, we have to remove those operations from both the numerator and the denominator, which adjusts both sample size and response rate. And so you will see some slight differences there. We'll probably look at report that a little bit differently on our briefing packages moving forward. But a couple of points I wanted to make about the response rates in particular is that number one, if you talk to anyone who's in the business of doing survey work, one thing you'll hear from them is that these are still very, very good, very strong response rates in general. And of course, you don't necessarily see it in the short time frame represented here, but generally speaking, they have been steady recently. But it doesn't, no matter what, anytime you're less than 100%, it means that there's always room for improvement. And so, we certainly recognize that more data is always better. And so if anyone on this call has an opportunity to, perhaps help drive that point home to us, to folks who might be responding to these surveys, that, if there's anything you want to do to make the numbers even better, more response is certainly one way that can certainly improve every piece of information that we have. So just to wrap things up here and get on to the Q&A portion here shortly, what's kind of coming next for grain stocks, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're doing a deep dive into the program this year. Basically, we've got a team assigned to that. Their task is to finalize all their findings and recommendations by September the 30th. Now, with that in mind, any need for minor improvements that come up, we would certainly make those immediately. Things like perhaps improving, any manuals that we have, any training documents that we have for our own staff, we can just make those changes on the fly. But certainly, if there's any more substantial enhancements that are found, dictating any need for changes. Those will be made beginning sometime after October 1st. And most importantly for you, any major changes, if we find any, will certainly be announced and communicated to folks moving forward so that there's no surprises if any significant changes get made there. So as we move over to the Q&A portion of the session here, I just remind everybody that all of our reports, of course, are available on our website. You see some contact information there as well. If you have any questions after the session's over, we're certainly here to answer those questions as best we can. So by my count, we've got, about 10 minutes left, I think, here. So we're going to work through as many of the questions as we can. So let me see if we can flip over to the Q&A tab here. We'll try to keep things bouncing around here. So let me scroll up to the top. All right. On April 8th, we released the grain stocks methodology and quality measures report. There's some information there. Traditionally, NASS has relied on a bottom-up count of the stocks of different grains to arrive at a state-by-state and U.S. total. Historically, when has the USDA began to rely on top-down analysis or balance sheet subjective adjustment methodology to arrive at a total? Well, first off, I guess I would say that maybe you shouldn't use the word always, but we've always utilized a top-down approach for most of our estimates here at NASS, including grain stocks in general. So that's not necessarily anything new. So I guess that would be my general answer to that. Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've clarified that, Lance.
All right, moving forward. In regard to the subjective stocks adjustments, what are the decision rules for adjusting stocks to corroborate the survey results? All right, so I think in general, a lot of the comments that were made throughout the presentation here, especially by Chris, and then hopefully a few of the comments I made, again, hopefully talking a little bit about how we utilize the balance sheet information along with the survey data that we have. One thing I want to point out is that a lot of this quote adjusting, I think that folks have been asking about ties specifically to revisions. And again, I just want to reiterate that our revision process has not changed. We have certainly been taking a very close look at the balance sheet in recent quarters and years. But for the most part, most of the revisions that we make are based on late reported data. That's continued to be the case. We saw a fairly substantial revision back to the June stocks last September, where we did employ some additional adjustments based largely on updated balance sheet information that we had. But since then, the last 2 quarters, we've seen some revisions again, but they've been driven by late reported data. So I just want to make sure as we're talking about this, that we have not necessarily seen a major shift in how revisions are made or how they're adjusted, but rather we're following the same rules that we followed in the past. And there is no fixed recipe for exactly how the balance sheet information is woven together with the survey data that we have, other than to say that, again, as we look at that survey information, we look at how it's performed in past years, past quarters. We look at all the different indications we have, whether it's a direct expansion, the different ratio indications that we get that Jeff and Chris both talked about. And then we match that up with what the balance sheet is telling us. And when we look at the balance sheet, we look at, again, relationships compared to how they've looked in the past, depending on the commodity, how they might tie in with things like livestock inventories. And we don't, as I've said in the past, we don't set a residual number, but we look at how that residual stacks up with what we've seen in similar quarters in the past or similar years in the past. And we're looking for how that relates to what the survey is telling us. And so it's kind of a melding of the 2 pieces of information to find the best possible estimate based on all of the information that we have, whether it's directly from the survey or all the different components of the balance sheet as well. So, Chris, or even Joe or Dan, do you guys want to add anything to that before I move on? Okay, I'm going to skip down a little bit just so that we can touch on a variety of the questions from some folks. Where is corn stored at feedlots measured, in the agricultural survey or the off-farm grain stocks? Chris, I'm going to let you take this one.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a gray area. Most of the feedlots would be considered, Lance can correct me if I'm wrong there, that would be on farm. Large feedlots can have their own, you know, they may actually buy grain from surrounding farmers and things like that, and they you know, they may actually be big enough to consider themselves an off farm, but most of them would be considered on farm.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I would concur with that. All right, moving ahead a bit. Let's see what else we've got here. When was the last grain capacity survey completed? Is there an update scheduled in the next census or otherwise? We actually collect capacity on the agricultural survey every quarter. We also collect it on the off-farm grain stock survey every quarter. And then we take that information and we actually publish capacity estimates on an annual basis. We publish that in the January stocks report. And so from that perspective, it's an ongoing process that we collect every quarter. Right now, we do not collect capacity information on the census, and we're not planning to add that back, at least in the near future. All right, let's see. How does the on-farm survey handle grain stored on the ground or in warehouses? Also, what measurement or subjective adjustment is used to account for an increase or decrease in grain in transit or on barges? Chris, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, like I said, anything that's on the ground should also be accounted for, whether it be on the on-farm side or the off-farm side. So obviously around harvest time, you see a lot of that maybe when we're looking at our data, you know, typically we don't like to see the grain, the total grain, the total number of bushels out there exceed the capacity, but around harvest time that does happen because of those parking lots with maybe you know, boards on the side with a tarp over the top of it or whatever. So that would be, we want them to estimate how much is on the ground or temporary warehouses or whatever. With regards to the in transit, that's really not picked up in either report. So it's a good question. Lance, I don't know if you have any more to add to that, but it is really not included in either one. So it's kind of a gray area as well.
Yeah, in fact, we actually instruct respondents not to include grain in transit. And that's largely tied to the fact that it can become a difficult thing to measure what's in transit, because where's the ownership? You know, you run a risk of perhaps getting some of it, not all of it, or maybe double counting, or perhaps you've got the wrong folks sample to find some of that in transit. And so that's why we specifically have excluded it. Obviously, that becomes a bigger issue in years when there might be something significant happening that's, you know, causing a bottleneck for, you know, grain that might be in transport. But otherwise, it's hard to necessarily analyze that specifically since we don't have the data specifically on it. I see by my watch that we're in our last minute or two of this. So there's just a little bit of housekeeping that we need to clear up here before we hit our ending time here. So unfortunately, we obviously have a lot more questions, as you probably can see in the Q&A box, and we were able to get through. Let me just assure you that we will get answers to all of those questions. And so they'll be posted along with the answers to the ones that we were able to get to in this session. So all of the Q&A Both questions and answers will be posted as part of the transcript from this session and all others out on our website after the meeting, sometime after the meeting is over. Also, you're going to be emailed an evaluation form link on Friday. Please give us your feedback. We welcome your comments and suggestions for improvement. Obviously, we made some changes to the format this year, so we'd love to hear specifically what you think about that and just everything that we did in the sessions in general. Last but not least, I'd like to thank you for attending today. We hope to see all of you back at noon Eastern time tomorrow for our open forum session. And then as a reminder, there will be breakout sessions after that tomorrow afternoon as well. So again, thank you to both Jeff and Chris for joining in the presentations here today as well. And as always, as I've left the contact information on the screen here, if you have additional questions beyond what we've talked about here today, you can certainly reach out to us using the information on the screen as well. So again, thank you. That wraps up our session for this afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you all tomorrow again.